A new miniseries on Netflix is something that I normally associate with disposable THC vapes and cheap motels. However, PainKiller gave me a few things to chew on and actually think about. Most of those thoughts were masturbation adjacent, but the ones that weren't were enough to make a YouTube video about. And for those that aren't aware, PainKiller is the story of Purdue Pharma, the makers of the drug Oxycontin. We're treated to 4 different stories, all centered around the drug, to give us kind of a whole picture, as it were. However, this show does something that I don't think it intended to. It made the drug company almost look like the reasonable ones. You see, they paint Purdue as so cartoonishly evil and single-handedly responsible for the epidemic that I had to do a tidbit of research. And to the surprise of absolutely no one, they exaggerate and dramatize a fuck ton of things. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me summarize these 4 stories and give you some of my non-masturbatory thoughts. Speaking of masturbation though, let me start off with Shannon Schaefer, played by Wes Duchovny. She plays the part of a pharmaceutical sales rep that works for Purdue and pushes Oxycontin onto doctors. She's supposed to give us the perspective from inside the beast, as it were, and she plays an absolutely vital role in this. Because without this perspective, we wouldn't understand that Purdue is unique in its pill pushing. And herein, viewer, is our first problem. This is not unique to Purdue. Having a young woman push and sell your product is absolutely not unique to any particular pharmaceutical company or the pharmaceutical industry in general. Now, is Purdue unique in its marketing strategy? I didn't do enough research to be able to definitively say yes or no. Let's just assume yes for the sake of argument. But it still doesn't stop this from coming off as a very bad PSA, as we are treated to her slowly getting corrupted into thinking all of the lies that the pharmaceutical company is pushing. It's even complete with a whole club scene where she's getting pushed to do drugs, specifically Oxycontin, of course, in the bathroom of a party that's being held by Purdue before she trips balls and falls into a fucking pool. Don't worry, she gets better. And all of this is actually made significantly worse by the writing, because it feels like her story kind of dead ends about once an episode, if not twice. You see, she goes around to all of these different doctors and she's constantly told that she needs to up her numbers, which is just pushing more pills, which is a very drug dealery thing to do, obviously. And she acknowledges this several times, but then just goes along with it and seems to forget about that in the next scene. Now, I do think that Miss Duchovny here does her best with Shannon as a character. However, the writing does her no favors. In particular, in one of the episodes, she's chased out of the doctor's office by this irate doctor who calls her a drug dealer and basically calls her a terrible person for pushing all of these drugs. And then in that same episode, she gets told that no, she's not going to get paid per pill that she sells. She's paid per milligram, so she needs to have all the doctors up their dosages of Oxycontin so that she can make more money on her bonus. And she acknowledges that all of this is bad in that episode. And then in the next episode, she's right back to selling because, oh, now I don't have any moral scruples. It feels very artificial, and it seems like it's only there to keep the episode count high. Another thing before I wrap up Shannon's character, they keep trying to make it seem like she is the hottest woman on planet Earth, but they cast Dina Shahabi to play right next to her, which just feels mean. Like, you're not going to gaslight me into thinking one of these women is hotter than the other. It's not going to happen. Anyway, the next character that we need to talk about is Edie Flowers, played by Uzo Aduba. This is a composite character that serves our story as kind of a narrator. You see, the main story, as it were, actually revolves around her retelling this and getting it recorded so that we can proceed with a new lawsuit against Purdue. However, I think Edie is probably the one character that I have the most problems with. Now, before I say anything else, I do feel the need to say that I think that Ms. Aduba does a fantastic job. In fact, I think all the actors are bringing their A game, except for Matthew Broderick, but we'll get to that. But I think Edie bugs me so much as a character because as a composite of several different people, she can just kind of be wherever the plot needs her to be and do whatever the plot needs her to do. It also feels like that they are filling a lot of time with just her doing something. Like, they give her this brother that is in prison for selling crack cocaine. And that's fine as storylines go normally, but it's kind of off the beaten path. I think they're trying to use this as a springboard to say that there's kind of a two-tiered justice system in that a low-level drug dealer like him is going to be put in prison while high-level drug dealers like Purdue Pharma get to walk off into the sunset and are free as a bird. But without another connection outside of that, there's really nothing for that character to do, and it's only tangentially related to Edie's storyline. Also, it's not brought up until like episode 3 of 6, so it really feels forced and out of nowhere to me. Also in the realm of complete plot device, she's the one that ultimately convinces the DA to actually put charges on Purdue. But this comes off extremely hollow to me because they threatened to charge them with lying to Congress. But up until that point in the show, she has been able to recount tons of other crimes that they have committed, which really just kind of makes her come off as the Oracle from the Matrix, if not an omniscient god. Also, I feel the need to talk about one scene in particular that is structured and phrased so awkwardly that I'm pretty sure it was written by a lawyer so that they didn't get sued for slander of some kind. The next character I'd like to cover from the show is Glenn Cryer, who's actually played by Taylor Kitsch from John fucking Carter. Sorry, quick aside here, but I think John Carter's a very underrated movie. However, his performance as Glenn is actually pretty great. It's probably my favorite of the show, which should be pretty obvious since he plays a very everyman type of thing, which must be hard for him as the former Hollywood it boy now slumming it in a Netflix show as an everyman, but you take the roles you can get. And in the case of Glenn Cryer, that is the role of a spiraling drug addict. You see, Glenn's story starts off with his stepson causing an accident that cripples his back, and that's how he ends up falling into a spiral of pain, followed by opioids, and then eventually leads us directly to Oxycontin. This story was obviously going to be the focal point of the entire show from almost every angle because he exists as, like I said, an everyman who is able to give us an insight into the average person's interaction with it. Somebody who's not typically a drug addict, somebody we wouldn't associate with that, but then spirals down because of the addictive nature that is undersold to him by Purdue Pharma, which I think is what the show is trying to really push on us. Not so much that Purdue is uniquely evil in that they're making heroin, but uniquely evil in that they mismarketed the product. Unfortunately, that doesn't really come off, especially in this story. In particular, because we have to set up his family, we have to set up a bunch of other characters that know him, and there's really not enough time to get down to Purdue Pharma per se, which normally might make this seem a bit out of place and kind of a waste of time, but I think that this story really just kind of puts into perspective a different side of the overarching story. And I don't know if that's because the characters are performed so well, or if it's the writing in this section, but I think it works very well and I really enjoyed it. However, I would be remiss if I did not say that this went on about an episode longer than it needed to, like this story, I should say, maybe. I don't know, I'm kind of rambly at this point, but I really felt like if Glenn had OD'd like at episode 5 and we spent episode 6 wrapping up everyone else's story, we would have been better off. However, I do need to point out that the episode that I'm talking about removing actually has this really powerful performance with him and his stepson, and it is truly amazing. I won't spoil it here, but it is truly amazing there. But it's also insanely sad, so if you do watch this, go in knowing that it's going to be sad. It's going to rip your heart out. One part of the show that definitely won't make you sad is the parts involving Richard Sackler, who is played by Matthew Broderick of Ferris Bueller fame. And is it just me, or has this dude not aged in the intervening years from, what was that, 87 till now? God, I'm getting old. Unlike fucking Matthew Broderick, you Benjamin Button bitch. Anyway, Richard Sackler is evil CEO man who is evil and a CEO. He's the one that really wants to market Oxycontin as this non-addictive drug that is just harmless and a painkiller, and who gets filthy rich doing that. Now, from a narrative perspective, Richard's character actually poses kind of a problem because he's the only real person, and that is to say that he's the only person that actually existed under that name and did all of these things allegedly. And that comes off as kind of a problem for me because all of these other characters can kind of act and remark and talk about things pretty freely. But with Richard's character, you have to kind of stick pretty close to what was actually going on at that time and what he actually said, because there are people around that still care about the true story. And that's how this show markets itself. So it presents a problem when 3/4 of the main cast doesn't exist. It kind of makes me question whether or not this guy is the guy that I'm seeing through Ferris Bueller's performance. And after doing a cursory amount of research, not anything in depth by any means, but it seems like they got the gist of it, but there's definitely a narrative spin, especially to this character, that I can't really ignore. In particular, it strikes me as odd in this essentially bio series, maybe. I'm not sure how you want to say this, but it strikes me as odd that they do something as fantastical as give him an imaginary friend. In this case, it's Agent Coulson as his uncle who is dead, and he's giving him advice. He's telling him that he should do better, blah, blah, blah. Which I get that this isn't a documentary, so taking some artistic license is not only warranted, but mandated in this case. However, you do run the risk of coming off as very, very biased on these very serious problems that were created by this product. None of this is helped, by the way, by Broderick's performance, because I couldn't help but see him in these meetings with all of these other people that look very professional, and they do fit the role of evil corporate businessman. But then there's Matthew Broderick, who looks like a toddler in his dad's suit. And I just couldn't help but think, why the hell is anyone listening to him? He doesn't look like a serious person. He doesn't look like he believes what he's saying. And I feel bad for making this comparison because it really shouldn't be compared. But the comparison needs to be drawn between The Wolf of Wall Street and this, because I think that Leonardo DiCaprio doesn't exactly look like a grizzled evil corpo businessman, but as an actor, he was able to sell it to the highest level in that fucking movie. Again, it's a very unfair comparison because you have Scorsese in Wolf of Wall Street and you have someone who I didn't bother looking up in this show, but the comparison is that DiCaprio can sell it and Broderick can't. And I'm sorry to say it, Inspector Gadget, but you just didn't sell it for me. So I'm sure the question burning in all of your minds is, what did I think of all this? And to give myself some runway here, I think it was flawed to say the least. I think that Glenn's story is obviously the most compelling and worth telling in our current cultural climate. It shows us the real impact that abuse of this drug has. However, the other stories have such huge flaws in them that I can't really ignore or explain away that easily. So I kind of come away a little conflicted on this one. And I feel the need to emphasize Shannon's in particular dead ends, like once an episode before the writers throw up their hands in the last episode and just kind of say, fuck it, she doesn't exist anymore, because they completely write her out as soon as that first lawsuit is over. And that's not to say that Edie or Richard are that much better. Edie comes across as judgmental and cold till we're meant to sympathize with her out of nowhere, like halfway through this whole series. And Richard kind of exists as a hat on a hat, since Matthew Broderick is playing him as evil corporate business goon, but he's still a pharma executive. You don't have to sell me that he's the worst human being to walk the earth. And honestly, I keep going back to my favorite Satan performance is definitely Peter Stormer in Constantine. If you look at that, he's confident and suave, and he doesn't need to have like devil horns or put on any kind of air because he's just the fucking devil. He's scary enough as he is. And I think Inspector Gadget could have taken a page from his book and just played the evil corporate businessman as a dude rather than some kitten-eating monster. And none of the complaints I've made so far have even touched on the editing and directing, which made my skin itchy at points. There's a ton of cuts to stock footage and scenes we've already seen in the show. Like, I get that this is supposed to put us in the mind of a heroin addict as he's having a trip or whatever, but Jesus tits, man. I feel like once or twice was enough. This happens several times an episode with characters that aren't even high, and it feels like it's really just there to extend the runtime by like 10% with all that shit. I could go on, but I'm running out of the time that I allotted for myself here, so I'm gonna go ahead and wrap this up and give it my recommendation of it's a solid give it a watch for one episode, and if you're interested after that, go ahead and watch the rest of it because it's very similar from there. But if you watch that first episode and find yourself kind of drifting off, go ahead and skip this one. Anyway, that's all I've got to talk about on this one. If you like this video, show me by leaving a like. I'm doing my best to improve on my videos here, so if you want to help me do that by leaving a comment and liking the video, that'd be great. Otherwise, I will see you in the next one. I have been Spiff the Ice King. Sayonara, bitches.